Hello and welcome to this special edition of the Physics Friar, coming to you from the National Science Teachers Association Conference at McCormick Place in Chicago. In this particular lecture, I'll be talking about the Church's particular way of looking at the world, its worldview, its sacramental worldview. And to introduce that, I'd like to read this line from The Auguries of Innocence by William Blake. To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. At the very end of this brief lecture, I'll come back to the meaning of that poem. But first, we're going to start out by talking about what a sacrament actually is. And then I'll also briefly review the meaning of sanctifying grace. Then we'll cover the question of how the sacraments convey sanctifying grace. Then finally, we'll get to that question, what it means to say that the Church has a sacramental world. Now, a sacrament is a kind of sign, but it's a particularly powerful sign. Contrast it to a stop sign. A stop sign points to the reality it refers to, but it's not identical with it. That is, if you see a stop sign, you might stop, but you could also roll right on through the stop sign. The stop sign means stop. It refers to stopping, but it doesn't actually stop you. Whereas a sacrament is a particularly powerful sign. It not only points to what it represents, but it also brings about what it represents. Baptism, for example, symbolizes your cleansing of original sin, but it not only symbolizes that, it cleanses you of original sin. It brings about what it represents. So a sacrament, then, is a special sort of sign that is what it represents. Jesus represented God's love, but he also is the embodiment of God's love. Jesus is a sacrament of God's love. We say, too, that the Church is a sacrament. The Church represents the people of Christ, and it is the people of Christ. And you and I could be called sacraments as well. Saint Augustine of Hippo, who was the person who said Deus semper maior, or God is always greater, defined a sacrament as a visible sign, something that you can see and touch, of an invisible grace. So you have something small and limited, like the communion wafer, or the limited time that you are baptized in. But somehow that limited thing contains this invisible and infinite grace. Through the sacraments, we both perceive that grace, but we also receive it. It points to and brings about what it affects. We perceive and receive the invisible grace of God's life. Which brings us to sanctifying grace. Sanctifying grace is the gift of God's own life. It's like God's presence in us, which makes us holy. That's what sanctifying means, to make us holy. It's habitual, a supernatural, habitual, supernatural. This word habitual is key because it's habitual, we don't really notice it. Sanctifying grace is like the ocean of grace that we live in. Just like a fish doesn't notice the ocean, and we don't notice the air that we breathe, we don't always notice sanctifying grace. The sacraments make it real for us. They freeze time for a moment and allow us to perceive, and in the same moment of perceiving, to receive sanctifying grace. But how could an ocean of grace be contained in a single finite moment? Here we come to the essence of the sacramental worldview, that the limited, the physical, the finite can somehow contain the infinite, or at least communicate the infinite to us. That's because the Church takes our physicality seriously. We're flesh and blood, and so God communicates to us through physical, tangible signs. We need physical, tangible signs to make us aware of the ocean of grace surrounding us, because the Church believes in the resurrection of the body and the goodness of limited, finite, and perishable things. Therefore, God communicates God's infinite self to us through our whole person, through created material realities, through bread, wine, and oil, light, and water, etc. And that's the Church's sacramental. To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour.